Hi everyone, this is Delton Jones, and I'm doing a restart or redo of our session we had last night, January the 19th. So we had an issue with not getting it recorded, and so I'm trying to do that now. We originally had several people in our session, and obviously they will not be there. And the first session was more of a question and answer session to redo an introduction to Genesis, first 28 chapters, and basically went through most of that. We'll get into that later on. But anyway, this is a second attempt for that, and we'll get started on it and go from there. So I'm going to do a screen share of that presentation, and we'll get that started now, and then we'll get it recorded, hopefully. So, welcome to our Zoom option session. This is a new one, new session, which will be going through the end of March. Our focus this time around is the life of Jacob. And before we start this study, as I mentioned, we're going to do a Q&A review of sections that we've studied so far. And this review will end in chapter 28. All right. And again, I apologize because the session that we had last night, I failed to record it, and we had multiple people there. So we'll go from there. This is my normal disclaimer. It's just a common sense approach for Bible study and interpretation. And I'd like a copy. If you want a copy sent to you, just request it and I'll send it to you. Family history. This is kind of family history exam. And the question you got to ask yourself is, what do you know about your own family history? Before my father and mother deceased, we did a video of each of those to learn more about their history. And it was a good exercise, and I wished I'd really done more than that. One of my cousins has written a book on my mother's side of the family, which is great. And we also have another relative that dealt with my father's grandmother's, or on my father's side, my grandmother's family there. And that was also a good book to look at and read. Question I got to ask you is, do you have anybody in the Bible itself that you're related to? And the answer to that is yes, every single one of you do. We're all descendants of Adam and Eve, which makes us related, and we all share common DNA from God's creation. That's obviously was a trick question, but I want to see if you understood what we're talking about. So you're related to a lot of people in the Bible, but are you descendants of everyone in the Bible? Adam and Eve, certainly yes, and another person in the Bible that we're all related to, obviously, is Noah. God destroyed everyone on the earth during the flood, and all that was left was his family. So you are related to Noah. Noah had three sons, Ham, Japheth, and Shem. If you're a Jew, you're certainly related to Shem. If you're from Europe, you're probably related to Japheth, although that's not a guarantee. So we all have a long family history, and we certainly want to preserve that. So let's start at the beginning of your family history. The first 11 chapters of Genesis are what's called the primeval time. And that's really related to the first age or ages, especially of our world here on Earth. So we'll learn from our study in Genesis, our family history of Adam and Eve, and these events are recorded in the early part of Genesis. And we're going to do a little test here, and everybody likes tests, right? So the creation is Genesis 1:1 through 2:3. Chapter 1 and 2 really deals with God's creation of the heavens and the earth. And we see in chapter 1:1, it states, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the question you got to ask is, what preceded the creation of the heavens and the earth? In verse 2, we see that the earth was formless and void. I'm not sure whether that means that what didn't exist or not. But certainly, it says in verse 2 that darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over waters. So we know that darkness was there. We know that God was there because he created us. We notice that the Holy Spirit was there because it mentions this here. And we'll also learn through Scripture that Jesus was also there. When did time begin? Obviously in verse 1 it said, in the beginning. So time began when God created everything associated with our world. What year was that? Some people say millions of years ago. If you were certainly born a few hundred years ago, that would certainly be the case. That was what most people believed in at that point in time, after science started coming into play. Most recently, we talk about billions of years. But if you look at it from a biblical perspective and what God says, 6,000 years ago is probably a better answer. I'm going to show you a chart here in a minute that shows 4004 BC as a biblical starting point for that charts. I'm not going to get into apologetics. Basically, apologetics is defending our Christian beliefs. In today's world, we have to be prepared not only to proclaim our religion, but also to defend it. And basically, that's what apologetics is defending our beliefs. My intent is not to spend much time on this in this session. I'm going to do a session in Colorado this summer, and we'll start with the first of Genesis. And certainly there, I'll spend quite a bit of time on apologetics. So the question is, how many days did it take for God to create the heavens and the earth and everything within it? And the answer to that is 6. How long is a day? 24 hours. See, I told you the questions were easy. What did God do on the 7th day? He rested. Now let's make this a little bit harder. What did God create on each day? Obviously, if you go into chapter 1, you can see that, and you can cheat and find the answers. But I'll go through it quickly. On day 1, God created and separated the light from the darkness. On day 2, he created a vault between the waters. He called the vault sky. On day 3, he created dry land and gathered the waters under the sky into the sea or seas. He created vegetation, and he proclaimed that it was good. On day 4, he separated the day from the night to serve as signs for times, season, days, and years. And with that, he created the sun and moon and the stars, and that's where we had our light to separate times. And with the rotation of the earth and the rotation around the sun and the tilt of the earth, that's how we have our time frames. Day 5, he created the fish and the birds. And day 6, he created land animals, which included livestock and wild animals. He also created mankind, and he says, in our image, which means in the image of God, and our likeness. So we have similarities to God from that standpoint. He also gave dominion of the plants and animals to mankind. And we'll talk about a verse in just a minute that deals with that. In day 6, God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, and then he rested. And what did God command mankind to do? And we see this in verse 28 of Genesis 1. And I'll quote it. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and in the birds in the air and over every living creature that moves on the ground. So this is a commandment from God, and it's very important as far as the rest of Genesis is concerned. We'll deal more with that verse later on in our sessions. The second point deals with the secession from the creation of the heavens and the earth, and that starts in verse 4 of chapter 2 and goes through most of chapter 4. And this section deals with the secession of mankind from the early beginnings. And a good quotation, a good definition for secession is the coming of one or person or thing after another in order, sequence, or in the course of events. And basically what we have is biblical history in sequence or order throughout the book of Genesis. And we'll cover this in more detail as we go through these. The next one is the creation of man and the woman. And again, we're still in chapter 2. First, the creation of man and woman. Who were they? Adam and Eve. Mankind was put in a perfect setting. And where was that? The Garden of Eden. We see that in verse 8 of chapter 2. What was in the garden? We see that in verse 9. The tree of life, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's a tree that Eve took the fruit from. There was a river in the garden, which was separated into 4 headwaters. They're named in verse 11. The only 2 we're probably familiar with is the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And they're located primarily in the Middle East, as we know it today. All right, next we have the temptation and fall. That's chapter 3. Chapter 3 deals with the fall. Question is, who are the main characters in the fall? God, Adam, Eve, and the serpent are the 4 main characters. Who committed the first sin? That was Eve. And we find that in verse 6 where she pulled the apple from the tree and ate it. And then she shared it with, obviously, Adam. Who did God blame? Number 1, he blamed the serpent or Satan. He blamed Adam instead of Eve. God felt that Adam was at fault here. And then we see this in Genesis 3, verses 14 through 19. And then after that, we have the curse. The question is, what did God curse? And the answer is just about everything. Curse the serpent. He has specific comments for him. He also cursed the woman. Primarily, her curse was pain that goes with childbearing. And he also stated that your husband will rule over you. He cursed the ground, which created thorns and thistles. So instead of the ground being easy to produce things with and so forth, it was cursed. And obviously with that, work. Man now had to work for his livelihood. And the key question about chapter 3 is what is the most important verse? My feeling is it's verse number 15. Why is it important? It's prophetic verse number 1. It introduces God's plan for future salvation, which is Jesus Christ. It also basically confirms that Jesus is a role helper for God. And let me just quote it for you, and then I'll explain it a little bit. And the quote is, "And I will put an enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Offspring in some versions of the text is defined as seed, and that, in my mind, that's probably a more accurate definition. But that seed is referring specifically to Jesus Christ. When it talks about hers, some people think that's referring to Eve, but in reality it's referring to Mary. It says, he will crush your head. He, being Jesus Christ, will crush the head of Satan. Your is Satan. And you will strike his heel. Satan will strike Jesus' heel. And that is done when Jesus dies on the cross. So, a little bit about that verse. I explain it in more detail when we do the actual Bible study on the first part of Genesis. Okay, now we have the advance of sin and Cain's murder of Abel. So we introduce more sin into the world through this process. And chapter 4 deals primarily with that activity. Who are they? They are the sons of Adam and Eve. What happened to them? Basically, in verse 8, we see that Cain kills Abel. The reason that he killed Abel was jealousy. And jealousy seems to be a common theme throughout the Bible, and the theme that God despises, or sin that God despises. And so we have more sin introduced in the world. What else happened during this chapter is later on in the chapter, God cursed Cain, and he was driven away from the land. We see that in chapter 4, verses 11 through 12. And it states, now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to rescue your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer of the earth. So this pretty well defines the rest of Cain's life. And basically he was separated from Adam and Eve and had to go out on his own. All right, now we have the spread of godliness and civilization. So this basically talks about the successors from Cain, where we see more godliness developing through mankind. And at the end of the chapter, we see the birth of Seth, which is in verse 24. And at the end of that, it says, at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. So we seem to see some correction from evil. So up to this point, what we're seeing in chapter 4 is basically a lot of evil taking place, and the descendants of Cain through that process. After this, we see the further secession from Adam itself. And this is chapters 5, basically chapter 5, a little bit in chapter 6 as well. So chapter 5 is a genealogy chapter, and we see that in verse 1 of chapter 5. This is the written account of Adam's family line. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. And that's the NIV version. If you look at the New King James Version, it talks specifically about genealogy. It says, this is a book of genealogy of Adam. So now through this chapter, we see the successors are the descendants of Adam. And we see it through their new son, which is Seth. And we're still in the early history of the earth. So the genealogy from Adam to Noah is in chapter 5, as I just mentioned. And if you're interested in your own history and where you came from, this is a good basis for that. And it's a good basis for time as well, because we see through this genealogy a description of this activity. And what I want to do now is show you this map, or this chart, which starts in 4004 BC. You'll see at the top of the chart Adam and Eve, and where Adam lived for 930 years, the scripture where it was talked about. And then we see Seth, he lived for 912 years, and then his successors all the way down to Noah. And you'll see that in after 1,056 years, Noah was born. So that's his birth date, and that's we can also, if we use 4004 BC as our time frame, we can also calculate from a BC standpoint when Noah was born. You'll also see there that we have 10 generations from Adam to Noah. The Canaanites generation is also below that chart. It's kind of in a light green. And you see their generations in the scripture where they talk about each of those. So apparently the environment before the flood enabled people to live longer. Certainly this could have been part of God's plan to fill the earth of Genesis in Genesis 1:28, which we talked about earlier. I'll just repeat that verse. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. So you get a good view from this chart, kind of the years that took place and how long it took. So now we'll get back to our charts. And now we have, I'm starting a new page basically here, and this is the corruption of the race and what takes place there. And I'm going to share a program with you here, or at least a screen with you here so that you can see that. Looks like we got that started. And we'll share that. Then we'll continue our presentation. So now we're into the second slide here. So this is still the primeval events. And chapter 6 deals with the corruption of the race. And it's a significant chapter from that standpoint. These verses show how wicked the human race has become, and that death was an ongoing punishment for whatever was going on. God basically regretted that he had made human beings and regretted that he put them on the earth. And we see that in verse 6. Genesis 6:6 says, the Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. And verse 7 basically describes what God's intent was to do about it. And that states, so the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. So he was sorrowful from that standpoint. What that leads to, and we see that in verse 9, is the succession from Noah. Noah was found to be favorable by God, so he spared Noah, and that's where we get into the account of the flood. So verse 9 states, this is the account of Noah and his family. And Noah had 3 sons, mentioned that earlier, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. From the sin that entail, we see the judgment, which starts in verse 9 and goes through chapter 8, verses 22. God basically asked Noah to build an ark. How big was it? It was big. 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet high. It had a displacement of 43,000 tons, big ship. Had 3 decks, and we see that in Genesis 6:15. He was asked to put 2 of every kind on the ark, 7 pairs of each kind of clean animals. He also put food on the ark for everyone. And then we see all of that described in Genesis 6, verses 9 through 21. We'll see in verse 22 that that Noah did everything just as God had commanded him to do. So he is very faithful from that standpoint. How old was Noah when the flood occurred? 600 years old. So if you take his birth date and you add another 600 years to that, you can calculate the time frame for the flood. We see that in verse 6 of chapter 7. And it's very specific in this case. It occurred on the 17th day of the second month of his 600th year. And if you calculate all that out and use your calculator or adding machine, you can come up with 2,348 BC. So a little over 4,000 years ago. Another question we get into, and often confusing because of our childhood stories, but how long did the flood last? Most everybody says 40 days and 40 nights of heavy rains. And that's a correct answer, but it doesn't reflect really the true depth for the flood. There was another 110 days of subterranean water upheaval. So basically the waters came up from the depths of the earth and continued for another 110 days. So the flooding really continued for 150 days. And then before the Noah and his sons were able to leave the ark itself, and their wives, by the way, was 377 days. So pretty long period of time. And so for a full description of what happened on the earth, you can look in chapters 8 and chapter 7 as well, and get a good description of that. If you, well, another thing I failed to mention, I skipped too far. The next thing we're going to talk about in the Bible is the curse of Canaan. Who is Canaan? Basically, Canaan is a grandson of Noah, the son of Ham. You see that in the genealogy, which we'll get to in a minute. What events took place to instigate a curse of Canaan? Basically, Noah got drunk after they got into dry land, and Ham observed his father being naked, and his two other brothers, Shem and Japheth, decided not to look and participate. But because Ham saw him naked, he mentioned it to Canaan. Canaan also observed the process as well, and so Noah cursed him, cursed Canaan. The primary reason he didn't curse Ham was because God had previously blessed Ham. He did not want to take away that curse. So, important chapter from that standpoint. The key thing about the Canaan, they were the start of the Canaanites, and the Canaanites were sinful people and a thorn in God's side for generations to come, even into today's time frame. All right, now we have the successions of the sons of Noah. This is another genealogy piece of work. Starts in chapter 10. It's all of chapter 10 going into chapter 11. So again, an important chapter from the standpoint of knowing our family history, biblical history. And so what we see is basically descendants of Noah all the way through the Table of Nations. So that's important from that standpoint. Many books of the Bible reference this chapter and the families there. So that's a reason it's important, and that's why it's called the Table of Nations. And that's chapter 10. So we'll see tribes and families and nations mentioned as we get through the sons of Noah and their descendants. Next, we have the dispersion at the Tower of Babel. Here's kind of a picture of that tower, or a depiction of that anyway. I don't think we had photographs taken during that day or pictures developed. But anyway, it happened at the plain of Shinar. The plain of Shinar is basically very near current day Baghdad. It's described as ancient Babylon, and from a biblical standpoint. Who was the king of this area? And basically that was Nimrod. You find that in Genesis 10, verses 8 through 11. Not only did he start this area in the valley of area of Shinar, the valley there, but he also formed the cities of Nineveh and Calah, which are basically the Assyrian empire that developed there in ancient times. Nimrod was the son of Cush and the grandson of Ham, and he is basically the world leader of this area of this time. And basically at this time we had a one world order, and we're getting very close to having another one world order that's going to be developing shortly, so prior to Christ's coming. What was the issue here in the Valley of Shinar from God's standpoint? Number one, there was only one language. Number two, they had a desire to enhance their own unity and strength, and that's the primary reason they built the tower, so they could reach God himself and become gods themselves. So a very key issue and a concern that God had. So what God decided to do from this was to confuse their language and spread them out to fill the earth. And this gets back to two things, really. One is pride. We see this in Genesis 11:4, in the verse there. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered over the face of the whole earth." And obviously, pride still plagues mankind today. So what did God basically do? He confused their languages and scattered them throughout the ancient world. And we see this in Genesis 9:11. All right, here's a map that was developed by a group, and they call it the Tables of Nations. And you see through this map where the Japhites were scattered, primarily to the north area, which is Assyria and some other areas. And you see it also into Eastern Europe there, and then probably also they propagated into Western Europe as well. Shem primarily settled to the Arabian Sinai area, and you'll see a little green spot there. I'll see if I can get my cursor over there. This is where Shinar is at, and here are the Canaanites where they settled, and Canaanites were Hamites, really, and most of the Hamites settled in the northern African area. So that's where God initially scattered everybody. So chapter 10 is important, and understanding where the tribes went is also important. And I took this book out of a Bible. It's not an encyclopedia. I can't remember what you guys could call it, but anyway, it's an excellent chart. So from there we have the successors of Shem, and that starts in chapter 11, verses 10 through 26. And verse 10 says, "This is the account of Shem's family line." Why is this important? Well, this leads to a very important person in biblical standpoint, which is Abram or Abraham. So that's why it's important to us. So what we have in these verses is the descendants all the way from Shem to Abram, and we have ages and which can lead us into time frames, which can lead us to the birth time frame of Abram or Abraham as we now know him from that standpoint. So this leads us to the start of the patriarchal line of the nation of Israel, which we'll be covering here shortly next. So basically, out of the scattered nations, God formed one nation, which became His channel of blessings. We're seeing that God was not done with the human race, and so Israel was established out of that activity, his family line there. And so what happened after Israel was established? And basically they got scattered also. So let's look at the family history, and I'm gonna all right, now we have a succession from Terah, and this starts in chapter 11, verses 27, and going through chapter 25. So this is a long line of succession, and this entails basically, if you get into it, really the remainder of the book of Genesis. So the successors of Terah. Who was Terah? Terah was the father of Abraham. He also had two other sons, Nahor and Haran. And this is stated in chapter 11, verse 27. This is the account of Terah's family line. And Terah became the father of Abraham, Nahor, Haran, and Haran became the father of Lot. Haran actually died in Ur, which is where they're located. And so Lot, when Terah left Ur and went to Canaan, Lot went with him. So Abraham also had his wife there. Her name was Sarai, and we see that in verse 29. And so Terah decided to take some of his family from Ur to the Chaldeans, where they settled, and they actually settled in Haran, Harran, which is in verse 31. And people that went with Terah was Abram, Sarai, and Lot, who's Terah's grandson. And we see that in verse 31. And I asked a question in our session, what children of Abram and Sarai actually went with them on this trip? And the answer is none, because they didn't have any children. And the reason is that Sarai was childless, and this is really a theme of the following verses, which becomes very important in our activity here. All right. So now we have a making of a covenant with Abraham, and this chart starts in verse 27 of chapter 11. And so remember, we're talking about family here, at least if you're a Jew. And the question is, are you a descendant of Abraham? No, not unless you're a Jew. So that's important to you. All right. So here we go with the call to Abram. So God called Abram out of a pagan world and made some astonishing promises to him. Promises that would become part of what we now call the Abrahamic covenant. The covenant is actually developed in phases as the situation dictates, but we'll see this in chapters 12, 15, and 17. And the covenant, by the way, is also confirmed with Isaac and Jacob later on in Genesis. And the question is, what did God ask Abram to do? And basically, to go from your country, your people, and your father's household. He didn't really tell him where he was going. He just said, I'll show you where you need to go. So we see that in chapter 12, verses 1. The Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. So he's having to go off in faith as to where he's going. Some of the promises that God made to Abram at this time: he'd make him a great nation. He would bless him. He would bless others through him. He would curse those that curse him. And all peoples of the earth would be blessed through Abram. And it states those in Genesis 12, 2 through 3. And I'll just read that. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And how old was Abram when he left Haran? He was 75 years old. We see that in verse 5. And where did Abram go? He actually started out, he went south into Canaan. He actually settled into several areas in Canaan. There was a drought in Canaan, so he went into Egypt to get away from the drought. So actually, he was a very nomadic person. He went from area to area and took he and Sarai and his nephew Lot with him, and in all those areas he went to. Did Abram always follow God's lead and direction? No, actually, he got in trouble a lot. He lied some. He tried to pass his wife on as his sister. And one major issue through this whole process was the fact that Sarai actually remained childless. And if you think about it, why this is an issue, how can Abram develop into a nation if he and Sarai had no children? And the point is, they cannot. So basically, what the issue is Abram and Sarai really had little faith that God was going to fulfill his promises, and this led to an issue with that. And so what we do is we see God coming back and making further promises. We see this in Genesis 15, starting in verse 4. And there he promised a son of his own flesh. And here's a quote from that. Then the word of the Lord came to him, this man will not be your heir. And what he's talking about this man is his head servant, and we'll see more about him later. But this man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. So he affirms there that his descendants will be numerous as the stars. And also another promise that God made, or prophecy that God made at this point in time, this is very key. He told him that for 400 years, his descendants will be strangers in a country not their own and will be mistreated. And this obviously is referring to the captivity of the Israelites in Egypt. He basically formalized a covenant with Abram there, and that covenant, as we stated, is another part of the Abrahamic covenant. And he also promised in this covenant that he would make his descendants, give his descendants the land from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. And this total area that was promised to the Israelites has not been fulfilled yet. And we'll see that fulfill when Christ returns. So basically, the land that God promised has not fully been occupied by the people of Israel. All right. Next, we have provisions of the promised seed from Abram, whose faith was developed by testing. And so this starts another session here, or the succession of Terah. So we talked about the promised seed, who is the promised seed, and basically this again is referring to Jesus. If you read the NIV version, it talks about the offspring again, and there's a footnote that deals with that. So in Genesis 13:15, we see this promise. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. Our seed. Okay? This is our seed. So if you look at the King James Version for clarification, Genesis 13:15, it says, "For all the land which thou seest, to thee I will give it, and to thy seed forever." And note that seed in this verse in the King James Version is singular. And Paul clarifies this verse in his own writings, Apostle Paul, and this is in his letter to Galatians 3:16. The promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. Scripture does not say are to seeds, meaning many people, but and to your seed, meaning one person, which is Christ. So as we get into the further chapters or the testing of Abram that he goes through, the promised seed was not conceived for many years. That's basically the birth of Isaac. Sodom and Gomorrah is destroyed. He had to rescue Lot from captivity. Another test he went through. He portrayed his wife and his sister again for a second time to the king in Canaan. He also did that in Egypt as well. He just had a tough time living up to what God wanted him to do. So as I mentioned, Sarai was not conceiving. She was getting older and lost faith. What did she do? She gave her maid to Abram to obtain children. We see that in chapter 16. Abram basically took the handmaiden and had another son through her. Was this a wise decision? No. Basically what it did, it demonstrated lack of faith in God that both Sarai and Abram had. Ishmael was born through Hagar, the maid of Sarai, and contention still exists today in the Middle East because of that. Chapter 17, we have more assurances or promises, and this comes through what's called the sign of the covenant. And if this is where we have changes to the names of both Abram and Sarai, and this is where God changes their names to Abraham and Sarah, which we know most commonly today. And it's also the instigating of the sign, and what is the sign of the covenant? And men should know this. This is basically circumcision, although probably most wives are probably as or more familiar than men are. And the promises are again stated that it would be fulfilled through Sarah. And how was Abraham at this time? He was 99. So he had left Haran at Haran at the age of 75. Now he's 99. That's a lot of years later. So again, Sarah is promised a child. She conceives that child a year later, and that son is born, and that's the son is Isaac. And so that makes Abraham 100 years old when Isaac is born. At that time, Hagar and Ishmael depart the area. They basically are run off because of jealousy with Sarah and the conflicts that caused. So in chapter 22, we see the start of another test. And sometime later, we see in verse 1, sometime later, God tested Abram. He said to Abram, "Here I am," and he replied. And what test is that? Basically, that's the test of the sacrifice of Isaac. So what we're going to do is we're going to end this session here. And this is where we actually ended last week or yesterday. with our discussion. So next week we'll start up with that, and hopefully we'll get all this recorded properly, and we'll go from there. So I'm going to stop the sharing here, and we'll stop the recording. I appreciate the ability to do this, and hopefully we'll see you next week.